Hello, hello, LinkedIn and my Facebook group. You know I like to experiment and send this to different places. For those of you who are joining us live, please like, comment, let us know where you're watching us from, and share so your friends and colleagues can join us. If you're watching on replay, comment as well. We'll get the message. We'll be able to write back. For those of you who may not know me, I'm Beth Granger. I'm a trainer, coach, and speaker on the topic of growing your business and professional brand using LinkedIn. And I'm also a networking facilitator. I've been going live every week, except for one that I took off, for almost a year. I'm very excited. It's almost my year anniversary. And I'm super happy to have my guest today, Tony Chatman. Welcome. Tony, I know from National Speakers Association. He's a thought leader in the area of workplace relationships, a very important topic right now and always. He works with organizations to enhance collaboration by improving leadership, expanding inclusion, and navigating change and disruption. And are we going through change and disruption right now? Absolutely. He's worked with hundreds of corporations, government agencies, including the Secret Service. Ooh, that's exciting. Chase Bank, Estee Lauder, the list goes on. He also has a book, which I want to read, called The Force Multiplier, How to Lead Teams Where Everyone Wins. And I noticed he told me it was his first book. So are you working on a second?
I am probably going to very shortly, yes.
Welcome, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Beth. Great to be here.
So I don't even know where to begin. Leadership, inclusion, change and disruption, they're connected, but they're different. How are they connected? Why? Tell me about that.
Sure. I think for all of them, and they're interwoven because they're necessary components with one another. And here's a great example. So let's say you want to deal with the idea of inclusion. So you're dealing with, for example, unconscious bias or inclusion, diversity and equity. Where many people fall forward is they go in and they start training on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they don't understand the dynamics of navigating change, right? And so what happens is now you've talked the talk, but you've not considered all of the obstacles. You haven't considered how to get buy-in. You haven't considered all the things that have to happen from a corporate standpoint if you're really going to create diversity, equity, inclusion. And then that also means you not only have to get buy-in from leadership, but leadership styles have to change. Because if they want to be effective, now they've led in a certain way that's allowed this culture to be one way, but now they need to change their leadership in order to facilitate that change. And so whether you start from diversity or whether you start from change, whether you start from leadership, it turns out that all three of them are interwoven as organizations really want to create a strong and inclusive and powerful and effective and all these other buzzword types of culture.
You know what it reminds me of? Years ago, before I started my business, I worked at a company and they did an employee satisfaction survey. And everybody told them exactly what they thought. And then the only thing they did was give us Casual Friday. So they didn't don't ask if you're not willing to address the things that people are thinking and feeling, right?
Right, exactly. And I think people just don't know better. They say, okay, now we got all this information, but what do we do? So they just go back and do all the things that they've always done.
And do you think it's better to start with dealing with change and then go the other way, or does not matter where you start?
It depends on the situation, right? If you'd asked me a month ago, I said, start with disruption. We're in a pandemic. We're in quarantine. People are now working virtually. Things have gone absolutely bananas. You ask me now, I say, you better start with DE&I because if you don't, you're going to pay a heavy cost. So I think that the starting point is situational.
For those that don't know what that stands for?
Diversity, equity, and inclusion. So DE&I is diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, it really depends on the situation. A lot of times the difference between change and disruption is you plan change, disruption just happens, right? So right now we've dealt with the disruption of a pandemic, but now we're also dealing with, a social, racial reckoning of a disruption that is happening. And so, the starting point varies depending on the context.
Got it. And just to make you embarrassed, Brad says in the comments that you're a genius. He's just going to put that out there. So thank you,
Thanks, Brad. Okay.
That.
Appreciate that, man. And by the way, I need to be on Brad's thing too, by the way. So I'm putting you on the spot, Brad. It's not going to be on as a guest. So I'm going to do that. Yeah.
And I'll have Brad on mine. It'll be a whole.
There we go. It'll be a thing.
Yeah. So with everything that's going on, to me, it's really how does an organization start? What besides bringing you in to speak with them and work with them? And do you just speak, or do you also consult on ways that they can actually implement all these things?
Oh, the whole thing. So sometimes organizations want me to come in and just speak and train and do things. Other times, like I have a couple of organizations now, they're just like, here, let me give you the keys, changes, completely change our culture. And, all of those are valid depending on where you are on the spectrum of your needs. So, where you start, I think, you really have to go back and do an assessment of where you are in some form of, okay, whether it's like you mentioned earlier, an employee engagement survey, whether it's listening sessions, whether it's just talking to your leaders and your opinion leaders within the organization, where are you and where do you want to go? You need to figure out, the starting point and the end point, and then you can do some strategic planning to connect the dots.
I have heard of some companies that have tried to do some things that didn't necessarily go well. LinkedIn, for example, we all know I love LinkedIn. We're on LinkedIn right now. They did some kind of a listening event, but the comments, they had a comment section and it was anonymous. So it got a little heated is the only way I can describe it. So I think organizations need help from the outside. They don't necessarily know how to do this for themselves.
Well, okay, so let's talk candidly about this. Let's not even sugarcoat it. Here's the problem. Organizations are used to talking, not doing. So what happens is right now, it's like the fad. Hey, we're going to put out a Black Lives Matter statement. We're going to put out this. But if you're doing that and you have a culture that's not inclusive, that has been racist, misogynistic, xenophobic, all of these things, then people are like, okay, you're talking, but let's look at what does your executive leadership team look like? Who are the ones consulting on making this PR statement? All of this is coming to light. And what people accepted a year ago, they're not accepting anymore. So yeah, they do need to bring in someone from the outside, but at the same time, they need to make sure that they have actions that are going to match these words, because people are getting called to the carpet in a way now that I have not seen in a long time. And honestly, it's the right thing that people have to say, no longer can I just make the statement and go back. And let's remember, if we're going to go here, let's remember it's only been a little over a year ago where we had a Black History Month with one fashion company putting out a hoodie that had nooses on it, one that had a little kid who was a model wearing a monkey shirt. That's only a year ago. And so people remember this. And so you can make the statement, but with that statement has to become an acknowledgement of here's what we have done. Here's what we're going to do different. Here's our commitment. And anything without that is lip service.
It's almost like all these companies, because of COVID, are doing COVID plans and very transparently and publicly and internally sharing what that plan is. They need to do the same thing, right? They need to be transparent and actually make change. Do you think it needs to start at the top of an organization? Any change or Can it start from the employees and work its way up? Does it have to start at the top?
It doesn't have to start at the top, but there has to be buy-in from the top. Okay. Because what happens is even if it doesn't start from the top is what's going to change policies, procedures, standing operating, SOPs, all of that stuff. So if the top doesn't buy in, they're either the gateway or the impediment. It's
Right.
one of the two.
Right.
And so where it starts doesn't matter, but at some point, top's got to buy in or it's going to be a problem.
I heard someone say the other day, I don't remember who said it, they said that companies hire for diversity, but manage for sameness. I thought that was an interesting, in other words.
Yeah. And well, it's interesting. I question whether even companies hire for diversity, right? There's that mirror effect where people hire people who are just like themselves. The reason I use the phrase D, E, and I, or even if I just say I&D, inclusion and diversity is creating a pipeline, right? You're trying to get a more diverse group of people within an organization. Inclusion is making sure that pipeline doesn't have holes in it, because you can put people within the organization. If you have a bad culture, a toxic culture, there's no opportunities for advancement, all of those things, then what starts to happen is all those people you put in the pipeline go, I'm not staying here. Or if they stay here, they realize I'm fighting an uphill battle. I'm either going to get disengaged or angry. It's an obvious dynamic. And so it's one thing to put people in the funnel. It's another thing to make sure that it's truly an inclusive culture. Yeah. And so, we need to hire for diversity, but we need to plan and promote for inclusion.
It's an interesting way of looking at that. I was in a conversation about, it happened to be a post about salary transparency in organizations, or not being able to ask somebody how much they made in a previous job. And somehow the conversation turned into other things you're not allowed to ask people on an interview. And I was once asked if I was thinking of getting pregnant soon on an interview before I started my business. So that should have been my clue to that I don't want to work at this organization. That an organization that asked that question, there are holes there. I'm not going to stay for long. So I've heard then, and I've seen, out and about, that companies are now hiring roles, people within the organization to have a role for diversity and inclusion. What do you think about that?
Yeah, you asked the wrong guy on that one. I'm going to let you know right now. Okay, so here's the deal. Yeah, we need to have a person over DE and I. Okay, that's or diversity and inclusion, or I'll try not to use the acronym. Okay, but here's the problem. If the first person on your executive team is over diversity and inclusion, how do we know that's not a token position? Right? That's a thing. And here's what, I know some people right now who are over diversity and inclusion of some major corporations, household names, and they're great at the job, but they also would have been qualified to be the CIO or the CFO. And so what's happened is they basically become the vice president of smooth jazz, right? It's like, we just brought you in this position, and we're going to let the minority go fix all the minority problems while we go deal with all of the things that deal with actually making money. And so, here's my here's my challenge to companies. I'm going to be very direct on this.
Please.
It is fine to hire someone who's over diversity and inclusion. That's fine. They better not be the first person in your executive suite, period. You need to have someone else, because people are qualified for this. And I heard Malcolm Gladwell say this on an interview one time, and it's always stood out to me. He said the problem, and this is coming from someone who was the second African-American to ever graduate from his university with his degree. And so I've spent the majority of my adult life being the only Black person in the room. The problem is, when you're the first, the only, you don't know if you're a trailblazer or a token. And you often can't tell on the entry. So if you're going to hire a person to come in and fix culture and all of these things, you need to give them not only, a title, they need to have authority, and they need to have budget. And when I say authority, that means they can make DE&I decisions without the other C-suite networks input, because that is their role. And that's what happens is they're put in this position. Other people don't see what they see. And so they're like, okay, that's great, but how much is that going to cost us? And so I'll tell you what it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you trending on Twitter for the wrong reasons, what it's going to cost you.
Yeah. And I think, especially, you're right, budget and authority. Otherwise, it's just a statement and, a role in name only, and nobody can make any change.
Yeah. And let me give you an example. So I am on 2 boards and a committee. On the board, one of the boards in the committee, I'm the only Black person. So I wonder consistently, am I really here because I'm qualified? And I am absolutely qualified and have contributed and made decisions. But is that why I ended up on the board? And here's the other thing, because there are people that have not advanced during this period of time, there are people on the outside who are going to be asking, are they qualified to be in this position as well? And so it's a 2-sided thing. You have the person who's coming into the position has to feel like, hey, I'm validated, I'm qualified to do this. And then everyone else, you've got to be able to silence them, because they're going to say, well, it's probably affirmative action.
We're both speakers, and the speaker community has been talking about this a bit as well, in terms of when you're invited to speak at an event, now virtually, but someday back in person. And this happened also with not having women on speaking panels. So do you ask the organizers, who else is speaking, and how does the makeup of the speakers match the audience? And maybe that's not important, maybe it is, but I think people are starting to ask the questions, which I think is good, right? And again, we don't want it to be that it's only people speaking about, right? Like, people should bring you in to talk about leadership and disruption, not just diversity and inclusion. You're
right.
More broad expertise. So tell me about your book.
Can I make a statement on that though, real quick?
Absolutely, please.
One thing, I thought about this yesterday, and so you bring up a good point. There's definitely a shift, and we run in a lot of the same circles, right? We're in a lot of the same groups on social media. We go to meetings together. It's been fascinating to see in the last 3 weeks, not only how many of my peers and associates said, hey, do you know any person who speaks on diversity and inclusion, right? And, there's a conversation, but at least 2 or 3 times a week I'll hear, hey, my speakers bureau is looking for someone who speaks or trains on diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And to me, I'm sitting here going, really? Let's put that in context. You have speakers bureaus, the agent and liaison between the client and the speaker, who's saying, wow, we've never even considered this diversity and inclusion thing. Do you guys know any good speakers? That's really eye-opening if you think about it, especially knowing, and when you start talking to a number of different professional speakers, and this is a very consistent thing, all of us, people try to funnel us into one of 2 areas, diversity and inclusion or motivation. They try to, regardless of whether your skill set is technology or leadership or law, they want you into that paradigm. And then, but what's obvious now is if you get put in that paradigm, you get forgotten about, right? So it's a very eye-opening thing that's happening. And so now, people are starting to go, okay, at this conference, and I've never, other than a conference that was specifically geared towards a minority audience, I don't recall ever keynoting and there being another Black keynoter. I don't think I've ever had that in my 14 years of being a professional speaker.
Yeah. We could talk about that all day, I think. But tell me about your book. It's called Let me find it. For the force multiplier, how to lead teams where everyone wins. What is a force multiplier?
Okay, so the force, well, here's what happened. One of my close friends who also is in the Army Reserve was getting deployed to Afghanistan. And we were having what we now refer to as a deployment party. It was a going away party, but he wasn't going away forever, hopefully. So in my house, I hosted this thing. We had about 50 of his closest friends, and we sat around, we had food. We circled them around at one point, and we started sharing, words of encouragement and making vows to, stay in touch with him, but also to make sure we took care of his wife and his 2 young children. And really, that's what friends do. And I was waiting for one person to share because he's a mutual friend of ours and he's a high-ranking officer in the Army. And he started his sharing by saying, "You're what we refer to as a force multiplier, because by your very presence, you bring out the best in every asset around you." And when I heard that, I thought, I've worked in leadership for years, and I've heard all of these definitions about what a leader is. It's, a leader has followers, a leader, leads change, a leader turns the ship, a leader does this. But nobody ever says, because the leader is there, more happens and people are better. Really, it should be that simple, because once a leader does that, they're indispensable.
Wow.
And so that gave me a new language and framework, because a lot of the ideas I already had, but I couldn't figure out how to put them in the right language. Hearing that language changed everything for me. So that's really the force multiplier. That book is you're a leader and you need to know what to do. This is not just a bunch of philosophy and theory. This is, how do you actually lead people and get the best out of them? That's the whole premise of the book.
I remember way back when the first time I managed people, my company sent me to some management training. And, it was, for the time, maybe it was good, but it was, it didn't get into what I thought as a leader, what I thought when I was being led. It didn't go into anything more than sort of techniques for getting people to do what you wanted them to do. And I think the world has changed, and I'm sure there are lots of things that you talk about in the book and when you work with companies that can help them. One of the things I was thinking about, and I don't know if I read it on your website or where I saw this, that you say that it's important for leaders to build trust, loyalty, and respect among their team. Yes, everyone would agree with that. How? How do they do that? I mean, that can take all day, but
well, okay. The simplest answer is don't be a jerk. I mean, it sounds crazy, but leadership magnifies people's weaknesses. So people get into leadership positions and all of a sudden they take on a persona that's not even who they are. And they feel like, well, I have to flex my authority and I have to do this and I've got to keep this person in the doghouse because that's how I'm going to motivate people. And maybe with some people for a short period of time, but far more likely you're doing damage. And if anything, people are working in spite of your leadership, not because of it. So, in all honesty, we know how to build trust, loyalty, respect. And part of it is trust, loyalty, and respect are reciprocated, right?
Yes.
So the more I show you trust, the more I respect you, the more loyal I am to you, the more likely you are to do the same to me, because it's reciprocated. The challenge is when we haven't done that and we have to rebuild it. That's more when the challenge comes. But really, as human beings, we know how to do this. It's just making sure that, we don't let the bright lights of leadership turn us into the wrong person.
I remember when, I'm a sole proprietor now, but when I had people working for me, I always liked to try to figure out what made them what made them tick. In other words, so I had one guy, incredibly talented person, for him, he always wanted to learn something new. So if he could once a quarter or whatever it was, take a class or learn, he loved that. I had someone else who they really wanted to have control over their own projects and not too much, check in, of course, but they really wanted to own it. And I think that's allowing people to come up with solutions that might not have been the solution you would have done, but if it solves the problem, allowing them to do it. I think that's an important, just a small piece, but something I think about. So I can't believe it. We've been talking for almost a half hour. We could go on for days. What haven't I asked you that you think would be of value to the people joining us? What should people be thinking about right now? Or what do you want to share? What are you up to?
Something I've been thinking about the last day or so. I talk about leadership, I talk about change, I talk about bias and everything else. I really realize that, especially in the area of bias, what's important right now is the ability to listen, right? So people listen, but A, they don't hear, but B, they listen without empathy. And so what I mean by that is, for example, a lot of, you look at what's happened since George Floyd, and some people are saying, well, why now? Why is this such a big deal? And what about all the other things? Well, when you start to actually talk to Black men and Black women and you hear their experiences, you find out that most of us look at that situation and have been in a situation in a moment in time where that easily could be us. But the key is to be able to listen through the other person's ears and not our own. Because what happens is we think, well, that didn't happen to me and that didn't happen to my friends. And so maybe you did something wrong. Maybe that was an anomaly. Maybe this. And the truth is, no, you're listening through your worldview and your bubble. But when you take the time to actually understand my view and my experiences and realize, no, this is a commonality. We've almost all been through this. Then we're able to start to get a level of understanding that will lead us to action. And I think that happens on an individual level. I think it also happens on an organizational level.
Yes.
When leaders in organizations start to really listen and not say, okay, yeah, but, no, not yeah, but let me try to understand where you're really coming from. So now that I can really take appropriate action that benefits everyone, that's really where we see a difference happening.
I think that is incredibly powerful in just life, right? Listening and listening with empathy. We do have a question. Ellen asks, she's wondering how to shift that view. So how to get people to listen with empathy when all they know is what they know, and how to shift that. How to help others learn this. Yes.
Sure. So I think the first thing is, so for example, if I share with you about a time I was killed by police, right? I'm doing so with the belief and the trust that you're actually going to listen. Okay. So that's a part of it. I think from your perspective is to start off with assuming that I'm right. Mm-hmm. Even though it's very different than what you've ever been through, assume that I'm right first, and then let things develop from there. It's possible that I'm not right, right? And it's very possible that if I'm not, it will come out in the conversation or it will come out later. But the problem is what we do is we use ourselves as the benchmark and we say, this is reality. We don't think that consciously, but that's what we do. So now I have learned, and I train myself even when someone's talking to me, I assume, okay, you know what? Because I've never, for example, this may shock you, but I've never been a white woman. Never, ever in my life. It's never happened to me. I mean, I've actually been Black a long time. So if you, Beth, did start, but if you start sharing your reality with me, right, I have to start not from, but I have to start from, I have never been in Beth's shoes. So now let me hear this, and then let me ask questions, not to validate my viewpoint or to prove you wrong, but let me ask questions so that I can really understand even more. So, how did that feel? What were you thinking about? It happened, other situations, and that is the way to help us to really learn this. And here's the thing: you and I are smart enough to know when the questions aren't real. Right?
Yes.
When someone's asking, a passive aggressive, whatever, I think when we come to it from that sincere point of view, we're able to reconnect. And I think that's really what's been happening. If you look at what's occurred in the last four weeks, it's because there's a demographic. Look, it's Black people. Black people have not been listened to, period. And so the anger you see, the urgency you see, everything else, it is in part from, we have been saying this for decades, if not centuries, and not been listened to. And now to go back and say, you know what? I'm hearing you. I'm trying to understand. I'm not trying to invalidate you. Let me hear your perspective. That is the beginning.
And do you see more? I mean, I know in my life, I've seen more conversations about it happening just within the past 4 or 5 weeks than ever in my whole life. Right.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it's people going through their life, not with blinders on necessarily, but just, dealing with their life and not thinking necessarily beyond their space. I think more people are asking the questions and saying, hey, do you want to tell me your story? What's it been like for you? And I think that's really powerful. And add that to the listening with empathy. I don't know. I think it can make amazing change.
Yeah. And I also think on the other end of it is people feel like it's now safe to actually say it. Because after you've been shut down so many times, you're like, you know what? This is not risking my job. This is not risking risking my emotional health. This is not risking me going through more trauma. It's not risking all these other things. Instead, it's far more, important for me to have, a chance to, now that it's open, to be able to say something. And, to Ellen's other question, their bias. Yeah. We could have a whole nother conversation on what we need to do to shift away from a bias perspective, which I think probably is a deeper dive into what Ellen was actually asking.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me today. I mean, we could go on for days, but people do want to eat lunch and move on with their day. I know. So I typically keep them to around a half hour. Thank you so much for joining me. People who are watching on replay, feel free to put comments or questions. Is there anything going on that you want to promote or share that people might be interested in anywhere that you're speaking that's public?
Everything I'm doing right now is pretty much behind the scenes
Yep.
and stuff that's not even been publicized yet. So I honestly can't even talk about half the stuff I'm doing right now. So
All right.
nothing. Oh, you know what? Here's a public thing. I
Yeah.
am to be, for those who are speakers, I will be a main stage speaker for the NSA Influence Conference coming up next month. So actually talking about unconscious bias. So that's one thing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody who joined us, and especially who shared comments or questions. It's always nice to know that there are people joining us and we're not just talking with each other, although that's fabulous too. And have a great rest of the day, everybody. Thank you so much, Tony, for joining me. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Beth. It's been great.